Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to Adrian's Digital Basement. On today's video, it's going to be a little bit different than my normal videos. I'm going to be telling a story about how I almost threw away something that was ultimately, I think, something that is super valuable, and it's going to involve this Apple IIe motherboard right here. So, without further ado, let's get right to it. So I'm going to tell a little bit of a story about how I normally work down here in the basement. So I'm really lucky to get lots of donations from viewers, which you see on Super Mini Mail Calls on the second channel, but I also get given stuff by local people here in town that I end up sorting through and often making videos about. This is stuff that's sometimes saved from going to e-waste, is basically siphoned off to me first to take a look to see if it's worth saving or worth making videos about, and then either keeping myself or returning back to the community. But plenty of times I get stuff where they are boards that are damaged beyond repair or just things that aren't particularly useful, so I sometimes send that stuff back to e-waste to be properly recycled. I have a very limited amount of space here in the basement and in my house. It really prompts me to think realistically about how usable something is and then decide whether it is worth keeping or moving on or sending to e-waste. So that's sort of my thinking when it comes to why I e-waste stuff. So today's video is about how I had something in the pile of stuff that I had to do a last minute quick sort on to decide whether it was going to go to e-waste or going to stay, and I almost sent something to e-waste that, well, now that I know what's in this thing, I would have been so filled with regret. Of course, I wouldn't have known if I had sent it to e-waste, but now that I know what's in there and this was a last minute decision, I am so thankful that I did take a look inside. Now, the item in question is this box right here. Now, take a look at this thing. It is a very nondescript project box, and if we rotate this around, it has just a button right here, and we look on all the other sides and it's just blank. There's nothing written there. It's just basically a gray project box that clearly someone made by hand. Now this box came to me exactly like this, and it just has basically two connectors on here. One's an edge connector, one is a DB25, and then it has a regular US mains input, and this is like a lamp cord. It comes from like a desk lamp or a light in your living room or something like that. So it all sort of belies how homebrew this whole box is. Now there's one other characteristic of this box which you can't tell on video, is that it's extremely light, so it doesn't really feel like much is going on in here at all. Now back to my process. When I have things that come in that I'm trying to evaluate what to do with, I end up sometimes with such a big volume of things that I have to make quick decisions, and I don't always have the time to take a deep dive into every single thing I get. And I thought that, oh, maybe this thing is just one of those serial and parallel printer interfaces, which it probably is when you look at these two ports, and it was just homemade by someone, so they didn't have to buy one of those commercial products. You know, it's probably just some simple microcontroller in here, whatever. They used a kit, and that's what this was. So when I first looked at this, I was like, you know, I might keep this connector right here because that's probably a real user port connector from the old days. It's like gold pins or whatever. It's not one of the cheap ones they have nowadays. And I thought, oh, this little port here, which has a very short little cable here, this D-sub connector, I thought, okay, you know, this might be worth keeping because I can reuse this potentially. You know, there's just soldered wires in there. So I was just going to chop those off, and then the rest I was just going to toss. So before I put it in my box of stuff to take to e-waste, I thought, why don't I take the screws off the cover and just for fun, just to see if there's anything that's potentially interesting in here. And I was like 99.9%, it's going to be nothing interesting at all, just simple off-the-shelf stuff. And yeah, you know, there we go, e-waste. So while I was out in my garage, which is where I normally do my e-waste sorting, I removed the flathead screws that were in here, and you can see they're already out. There were 4 of them, and I popped the cover off. And let's just lift the cover off here right now. Take a look at what I saw inside. There it is. Now, from a quick look, we can see here that there's a power supply. Oh, and I think I stuck the screws right there. So there's a little power supply board, there's a small transformer, and then there's this handmade board here. But what piqued my interest was this white IC. With the lid off, I took in what my eyes were seeing. What we have here is a MOS 6502 from the 52nd week of 1975. I was absolutely gobsmacked. I couldn't believe what I was looking at. I honestly cannot tell you how shocked I was to see inside this box a processor as old as this. Now, I'm not super up to date on the 6502 history, other than Chuck Peddle made it, and it's one of the most important processors of all time when it comes to home computing. But I do know that it came out in 1975, and it's the very early ones that come in this white ceramic package like this. It's a little bit of a head scratcher why someone would use a 6502 in what is obviously based on the fact that there's only, well, 2 pins on this connector here, a serial to user port converter. You have to remember that in the mid-70s, when the processor first came out, like the 6502, or before that, the 6800 from Motorola, which of course the 6502 is based on, that was a very expensive part in your computer. Like a substantial part of the cost of building a computer was the CPU. And looking at the other ICs in here, like this one here is from 1977, I think this one's from 79, and these other ones are from the mid-70s, you can tell that this thing was probably put together in the late 70s when the 6502 processor still would have been a very expensive part. Well, to answer the question of why this chip was used in here, let's do a little bit of reading on the history of the 6502. So we'll start with Wikipedia, which has a pretty good article on the 6502, and of course Chuck Peddle led the project. There he is, rest in peace, Chuck. What is widely understood about the 6502 and the 6501 before it is it's a simplified and low-cost version of the Motorola 6800 processor, which of course was used in the Southwest Technical Products Corporation 6800 PC, which has had several videos on my channel. The 6800 and 6502 are very similar to each other in functionality, but the 6800 apparently was very expensive and they didn't want to offer a lower cost version. So that's where Chuck Peddle and his team came in to develop a much cheaper alternative. And right here, this paragraph says, when it was introduced in 75, it was the least expensive microprocessor on the market and by a considerable margin. I think that's one of the reasons why it was so absolutely successful in very low-cost systems. When trying to figure out when the actual 6502 entered production, the Wikipedia article says that Chuck Peddle's goal was to sell the first run of 01 and 02 processors at the Westcon trade show in San Francisco on September 16, 1975. Advertisements in September showed the price of the 6502 to be $25 in 1975 dollars. To put that in perspective, at the same time, the Motorola 6800 was $350 for one chip, and Intel was charging the same for its 8-bit processor, the 8080. If you think about Woz's Apple I that came out just a couple years later, initially using the 6501 and then switching to the 6502, its $666 price point would have been far greater if it had had to use a Motorola 6800 CPU in there. So right there, that was just one of the main reasons that started enabling computers that were not crazy expensive to get in the hands of home users. So that brings me back to this box. Why exactly did someone put a $25 processor into something where you could have used a much cheaper microcontroller in here to do this type of work? And I can guarantee you that inside those commercially available printer adapters for Commodore computers that would have been available at the time when the Commodore PET came out, they wouldn't be using a 6502 in there. They would have been using something a little bit less expensive. Well, I think the reason that this chip is in here is because this particular processor, if it works, actually contains a bug. And we can see that right here in the Wikipedia article. The preliminary datasheet listed only 55 instructions for the 6502, and it excluded the rotate right operation, ROR, which did not work correctly on the early versions of the chip. In fact, the reviews of the processor that had been published a little bit before the chip was released in September noted that the ROR instruction was missing and didn't work right. In May of 1976, a revision to the processor was made and it actually corrected that. And then the datasheet now listed all 56 instructions, which are well known for every 6502. So you may be wondering, what does it matter that there's a missing instruction? You just program around it. And yeah, actually that's what people did when they were first using the chip, like for the KIM-1. But it's such a useful instruction that anytime I looked at the kernel or the boot ROMs on any systems that were 6502 based, they all seem to use this ROR instruction at least once, but often many times. So while this chip right here is a valid 6502 processor, you would think you'd be able to use it in your Commodore PET or your other project, but the reality is, without that instruction, it's actually much more difficult to use. Now, what I'm quite amazed about is this processor right here was made on the 52nd week of 1975. And if you think about the fact that the original production units in the end of September would have been week 39, this chip is really early on there in the actual production run of the 6502. And I don't think there's any information on how many chips were actually sold at that time. But before any actual commercial computers used this in production, we have to imagine that it was just hobbyists and maybe companies looking to design things who were buying these up. So there couldn't have been that many of these chips that have this particular bug in them before the updated version of the chip came out in May or June of 1976. There's a little bit of a conflict on when the update came, but yeah, it was somewhere there in the middle of 1976. Also, incidentally, I'm recording this video on the 30th of September, 2022. That means that the 6502 processor is just over 47 years old, at least from when it was first sold. That's pretty amazing. And this chip right here is just under 47 years old. This actual chip was made in a factory nearly 47 years ago. I myself am only a little bit older than that. So my hunch is for why this chip is used in this box is because someone probably owned an early version of the chip and they replaced it with one of the bug fixed ones and had this sitting around in a box and thought, well, maybe I'm going to use it. So they built up this board here, which does this serial to parallel or serial to user port conversion, and at least got some use out of the chip. If you're not using the ROR instruction, the 6502 processor in here works like any other, and it's just as functional as any other. Now, when we look at this board, which has an Archer logo right here, so we can tell this was bought at Radio Shack. It's got a ROM chip here, obviously it has the processor. It's got a 555 chip here, which might be generating the clock signal, or maybe it's the reset signal, and there's an oscillator on here somewhere else for generating the clock. And it's got this large 40-pin DIP, which is almost certainly like a parallel I/O type chip that is going to be hooked to the user port to allow the processor to easily talk to all of those 8 bits that come from the Commodore machine that this would have been connected to. What you don't see on here is what looks like normal RAM. And of course, you need RAM for a processor to work most of the time. I mean, it can run out of the ROM, but some RAM is useful. Well, I sent a picture of this with all the ICs to my friend Frank, IZ8DWF. Check out his channel if you haven't already. It's very interesting, super smart guy. And he identified that one of these ICs in here, which we couldn't quite figure out, was a shift register. And you can use shift registers as RAM. In fact, the very earliest terminals, the TV Typewriter, and there's a great video on Tech Time Traveler about that, it used exclusively shift registers for the screen buffer memory. I also took the ROM out of here and I did dump it on my Retro Chip Tester Pro because it's the only thing I have that can actually read chips like that. And this is a 256 byte EEPROM, and you can see the code right here on screen. I will of course upload this to archive.org, so if you want to disassemble this yourself, feel free. But being the ROM is so small, I did a quick disassembly of it, and here it is right here. And Frank, who's sort of an expert at 6502 assembly language, took a look at it and he confirmed it's basically what we thought it was, a user port to serial converter. And it's written very cleverly to work around the fact that this doesn't really have much RAM, but it does do the trick. And if we take a look through here, you do not see the ROR instruction anywhere. Well, take my word for it, it's not there. So the reason why I'm talking about all this ROR bug stuff is that I want to take this processor out of this thing and I want to test it in a real computer. The problem is I can't just stick it into a VIC-20 or an Apple II because the kernel or the boot ROM on the Apple II, it uses the ROR instruction, which does not work properly. Now here's a great article on Pagetable.com that talks about the fact that this instruction is missing from the very early chips. They did some testing on an early version of one of these chips as well that contained the bug to document what exactly it does. And I'll put a link to this article in the description, so if you want to read more about it, you can do so. But in summary, I'll skip to the end here. If you run the ROR on the early 6502, it does these things wrong. It shifts left instead of right, so it behaves like ASL, and it shifts 0 in instead of C, which is also like ASL, but it also doesn't update C, which is one of the registers, as if it wasn't a rotate instruction at all. So that's the flaw in this old processor here that prevents me from using it on anything new. Well, my dream of testing this beautiful old ceramic processor in a computer is not totally lost because, of course, I asked Frank, the expert in programming, if he could just write a custom ROM from scratch that I could put in this Apple IIe motherboard here that could actually run the computer and then test for the ROR instruction and tell me if the processor is the original bugged version of the processor or if it's one of the more modern ones that totally works. And in this regular Apple IIe motherboard right here is that custom ROM. It is installed right here in the EFROM socket because, of course, when the 6502 starts running, it jumps to a location at the very top of memory space, FFFC or something like that, to get its reset vector to begin execution of code. The thing about the 2E that's nice is you can use a 2864 right in the motherboard with no adapter, and that's what I'm using here. And what I did is I installed a ZIF socket in the motherboard right there, and there's actually a MOS 6502 installed in here at the moment for testing, that is. And I'm using the ZIF socket because once I pull this processor out of here, I don't want to stress out the really beautiful gold legs by unnecessarily jamming it in and out of sockets. I could bend a pin or something like that. So I'm going to be using this ZIF socket for all of the testing. All right, so first off, let's do some testing with this known good processor and this ROM just to make sure this computer is booting and executing the code. Frank designed this ROM like literally in an hour for me, and we have not tested it on a real bad processor. He doesn't have one. There probably aren't that many people on the planet that have one of these bugged 6502s, or at least know about the fact that they have a bugged 6502. All right, the power supply is connected, the RetroTink is hooked up, we have the signal on screen. Let's turn this on with the regular known good MOS 6502 in there, and there it is. Welcome to the early 6502 test. This is a regular 6502. So any processor from that May or June 1976 on should show up as a regular 6502 because it has a functional ROR instruction. Now the ROM is extremely simple. I can't type anything on the keyboard. It doesn't make a beep. It doesn't do anything. All I had him do was just initialize the text mode on the Apple II and print the message. So the two possible outputs here are the regular 6502, and I think the other possibility is early 6502. So I think at this point, it's time to try to take this chip out of here, out of this test board here, very carefully I might add, and put it into this Apple IIe, and see if it A, works, and then B, is one of the bugged chips, which we can assume it is based on the date code. So before I pull this out of here, one of the things I definitely intend to do is oh, look at that, I haven't actually taken this out. I haven't done anything with this thing. I intend to keep this board as is right here for display purposes. I just want to validate that this chip is actually running, and then I'm going to go buy one of those shadow box things and put this thing back into the shadow box just so I can actually have this thing on display because it's just such a cool thing, at least to me. If we take a look at the board here removed, and this is literally the first time I've done that, it's a pretty cool design because it is just with this edge connector here, which means that this thing here, these wires and stuff, are not permanently connected to this board. But it is all wire wrapped. So flipping this over, we're going to see, there it is, completely handmade. How beautiful is that? There's something about wire wrapping to me that just, it's really, really cool. And it's great that you could go down to Radio Shack and buy this proto board with the sockets and some of these chips potentially, and the wire wrap tools and the wire wrap interconnect, and make this board yourself after sketching up the schematics on a piece of paper, which is certainly how this person did it. All right, so now to get the chip out of here. I'm scared as anything, but I'm lifting it and it is coming up. So I'm just gonna very carefully remove it. Oh, there it is. Let's move that out of the way. And there we have it. A beautiful 6502 processor in white ceramic from 1975. And let's just look at the other side. There is a code printed there, 75073, whatever that means, unknown. So one thing I'm noticing is that the pins on this side, they're kind of bent out a little bit. And if we take a look here, you can see that it's not as long as the other ones because someone has gone and kind of folded them so they stick out further. And I'm assuming that's because the socket that was on this board here, it's got this kind of bodge thing going on right there. And I guess the socket they used, it just had a missing pin. But we have to remember when this person was using this particular chip in this project, the chip was kind of considered junk because you couldn't use it in any modern 6502 machine because of that missing instruction. Now here's the 2E with the ZIF socket. Now the ZIF socket here is a good quality ZIF socket that I found in an old project box, probably from the 70s as well. And it is not soldered into the motherboard. It actually has pins attached to the bottom of it. Like I installed a row of pins and that way it is pushed into the socket. So I intend this ZIF socket to be the permanent home of this 6502 processor. So I think it is now time to test this processor. Does it work? There it is in there. I've closed it down. We have pin 1 right there. And this was the orientation of the original chip that I had in here. And the notch is following the notch on all the other chips facing towards me. Here we go. I'm pretty nervous. Does this chip even work? I almost threw it away. Maybe it's gonna spite me and just not work. But here we go. Let's turn it on. I think it's gonna work. I'm feeling very confident. Oh, look at that, it freaking works. Welcome to the test. This 6502 has the ROR bug. It's 47 years old and it still works. Amazing, like it's just, wow, 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 wow. That's incredible. Frank, I know you're gonna be watching this video. You did a great job. You made this ROM, this test ROM, in like an hour, and it just freaking works. It detects this chip versus the other one. That's just amazing. Absolutely amazing. All right, well, we know it's working. I'm curious if it's getting warm. It's not even getting warm at all. That's very cool. These other chips on the board here, well, nothing's really warm yet because the Apple IIe runs pretty cool. Actually, that chip's getting warm. But this old 6502 is a survivor. It's such a survivor. All right, I think everyone's gonna be asking the question, what if I put the original stock ROM back into this? What exactly is gonna happen? And the ROM, by the way, is the unenhanced Apple IIe ROM. It's the earlier of the two. Let's switch back to the original ROM, which I happen to have right here. Now I have a socket in a socket because the original sockets on the Apple IIe are kind of junk, at least on this old motherboard. So I didn't want to be plugging a ROM in and out while I was testing this ROM that Frank made because I took it in and out of the board for programming a whole bunch of times. But let's put the original ROM back in. Let's turn it on and see what happens. Oh, well, so much for it not working on Well, that's absolutely hilarious. I completely expected it to not work because I did look in the code and I saw the ROR instruction. But you know what? What I didn't look at for the Apple IIe ROM was where in the code that was actually occurring. And it's quite possible that it occurs in some other routine and not in at least the boot part of the ROM. Well, there it is though. We have a freaking functional Apple IIe running a 1975 6502 with the ROR bug in silicon. I'm sitting here and I'm looking at the motherboard with the processor in there and it's running the Apple II code there. And I'm kind of at a loss for words, actually. It's really amazing that something as old as this can work. I mean, it's not the first time I've looked at 1970s chips and had them work. It's just that the 6502 is so special to me because my first computer the first computers that I ever had, the VIC-20, and then the Apple II Plus, and then the Apple IIc, they were all 6502 based computers. So this chip is where it all started. Now I know it's not, one of the original September of 1975 chips, but it's really, really early on. And of course I can't help but think, who bought this chip? Did someone buy it to play around with? Did they put it in prototype boards like this? Or was it in a KIM-1, which of course you could buy from MOS for, testing purposes and stuff like that? I just don't know. There's a lot of questions, but I'm absolutely stunned that this thing works. And I'm stunned that I almost sent it to e-waste. And I'm so glad that I had the correct thought, because I shouldn't send stuff to e-waste without looking inside. It was stupid of me. And I'm really glad I caught myself and I looked, because now I have this piece of history, which is really incredible. Like it's so special to me. And yeah, it's going to live in that ZIF socket in this board. I'm just going to plug the ZIF socket into here, and then I'll be able to have it up on the wall and know that this chip works and it survived, and now I can admire it in all of its glory, in all of its 75 glory. Anyhow, I think I've run out of things to talk about here. I'm stunned. I am absolutely stunned. I'm happy. Lots of mixed feelings, but really, really cool. And if you like this video, thumbs up. I'll put links in the description to the various things, including Frank's ROM code, if you want to take a look at how he wrote the code to do this test, and all those other links of the things I showed will be down below. And thank you for whoever put this thing into this board and made this printer box that, ended up in my possession. Just freaking awesome. Thanks to my patrons. Thanks to you for watching, and subscribe if you haven't already. Comment down below, and yeah, anyhow. Whew. Okay. Stay healthy, stay safe, and I will see you next time. Bye.